They got the call on a Wednesday morning. Their father was gone. Heart failure, the paramedic said, sometime in the night. Gary and Paul Bodine drove up from Nashville, handled the arrangements, shook hands with people they barely recognized at the funeral, accepted the casseroles and the condolences, and were back home by Sunday. The house would go on the market in the spring. The estate attorney would handle the paperwork. It was sad, the way these things are sad. But their father had lived a full life, and they had their own lives to get back to. The dog had run off somewhere during all the commotion, probably spooked by the strangers in and out of the house. They put up a flyer at the gas station on their way out of town. Gary thought about it briefly on the drive back to Nashville, and then the radio changed, and he thought about something else. That was the last either of them considered it. But 3 weeks later, a county deputy called Gary's cell and said his father's German Shepherd had turned up 18 miles from the property, and what they had found was going to require the family to make the drive back to Tullamore. Gary almost didn't go. He would spend a long time afterward thinking about what would have happened if he hadn't. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Now let's continue. Walter Bodine had farmed the same 40 acres outside Tullamore, Tennessee, for the better part of his adult life. He had inherited the land from his own father at 26. They spent 2 years not knowing what to do with it, and then quietly decided to figure it out, the way Walter decided most things, without announcement, without drama, and with a patience that people who knew him well recognized as one of his defining qualities. He grew tobacco for a while, then soybeans, then settled into a modest mixed operation that was never going to make him wealthy, but sustained him reliably and kept him close to the land in a way he seemed to need, the way other men needed conversation. He was not unfriendly. He was not cold. He was simply a man who existed most fully in silence and in work, and who had long ago made peace with the fact that not everyone understood that about him. Ruth had understood it. They had married young, built the farmhouse together over 2 summers, raised Gary and Paul in it, and spent 38 years in a partnership that their sons would later describe as quiet, but never distant. Ruth was the one who talked. Walter was the one who listened and then did. When she was diagnosed, he drove her to every appointment, sat in every waiting room, learned the names of every nurse on her floor. When she passed, he came home, walked the fence line twice, and then went inside, and did not emerge until the following morning. He never fully explained his grief to anyone, and no one who knew him expected him to. He carried it the way he carried everything, inward, intact, and without complaint. His sons had grown up watching this, and had absorbed different lessons from it. Gary had taken from his father a certain steadiness, a reluctance to panic that served him well in his work as a project manager, but made him, so his wife sometimes said, difficult to read in moments that called for openness. Paul had taken the silence as a kind of permission, a blueprint for self-sufficiency that he had stretched, over the years, into something closer to detachment. Neither of them had intended to drift from their father. It had happened the way most drifting happens, gradually, incrementally, each small absence slightly easier to justify than the last, until the distance between them was large enough that closing it felt like too big a project to begin. They called on holidays. They visited when schedules allowed, which was less often than they told themselves it was. They asked if he was fine. He said he was fine. They believed him because they needed to. Somewhere in the middle of his 60s, Walter had gotten a dog. Not from a breeder, not with any particular plan. A woman at his church had taken in a litter of puppies from a stray and was quietly desperate to place them. And Walter had looked at one of them, a male, black and tan, with oversized paws and an expression of solemn curiosity that Walter apparently found agreeable, and had said he'd take him. He named the dog Cobb, after a great-uncle he had admired, and from the beginning treated him with the same matter-of-fact care he gave everything he decided to take responsibility for. The dog was fed well and walked daily and spoken to in the low, unhurried way Walter spoke to things that were listening. What Walter had not anticipated was how much the dog would change the texture of his days. He had expected company. He had not expected the particular quality of company Cobb turned out to be: attentive in a way that felt almost deliberate, responsive to Walter's moods without making a performance of it, content to exist in silence alongside him for hours at a time without demanding anything other than presence. Walter had lived alone for 6 years by the time Cobb arrived and had adjusted to it, or told himself he had. The dog revealed the adjustment for what it was: a management of loneliness rather than an absence of it. With Cobb, Walter stopped managing. He just lived. His neighbor Gretchen, who had known Walter for 15 years and visited regularly enough to track the change, said that the Walter she saw after Cobb arrived was more at ease in himself than the Walter she had known before, and she was careful to say it that way. Not happier. Here's because happiness had never been quite the right word for Walter, but easier. Like something he'd been holding had been set down. Cobb rode in the truck. Cobb walked the fence line in the mornings. Cobb sat on the porch in the evenings while Walter read or watched the light change over the fields, and slept at the foot of Walter's bed, with a solidity that Walter once told Gretchen was, absurdly, one of the things he looked most forward to at the end of a day. Just the weight of the dog there, the steady proof of another living thing in the room. Gretchen had not found this absurd at all. She had found it one of the saddest and most human things a man had ever told her, and she had made a point after that of coming by a little more often. Walter had also, in the years after Ruth died, had become quietly and almost invisibly involved in the lives of the people around him. This was not something he announced or discussed. It was something he simply did, with the same practical efficiency he brought to fixing a fence line or rotating a crop. The Dietrich family, a young couple named Marcus and Sarah, who had come to Tullamore from out of state with a child and a plan and very little else, had been leasing 10 of Walter's 40 acres for 3 years when Walter first began to take notice of them in the way he took notice of things worth paying attention to. They were there before dawn and still working after dusk. They amended the soil properly, rotated correctly, asked questions when they didn't know something, and listened to the answers. Herr Marcus had come to Walter's door in the second winter to apologize for a late payment, and Walter had waved it off, and then, 2 days later, had quietly plowed a stretch of their road that had become impassable after a freeze. He never mentioned it. They thanked him. He nodded and changed the subject. Gretchen was 73 and had lived in the county all her life, and had no children and no family within 300 miles. Her husband had died a decade earlier. She managed well and was careful not to be a burden, which was a carefulness Walter recognized and gently, systematically dismantled over the course of several years. He brought things over under pretexts that both of them understood were pretexts: a surplus of tomatoes, a question about a recipe, a piece of equipment he thought she might find useful. See, he checked on her during ice storms without being asked. One winter when her furnace failed, he had a repair technician out within 4 hours, and when Gretchen reached for her checkbook, Walter had already paid over the phone. She had been furious and grateful in equal measure, and had told him so, and Walter had said something like, What else would I do with it? Which was as close as he got to tenderness expressed in words. He had also, in the last 2 years of his life, started making trips into Hendricks. Gary and Paul did not know about these trips. Gretchen knew about some of them. The woman who ran the notary office, Paulette, knew about all of them. Walter would load Cobb into the truck, drive the 18 miles to Hendricks, take care of whatever needed taking care of in Paulette's office, and drive home. He was methodical about it. But he brought documents in folders, asked questions, listened to Paulette's explanations, requested adjustments when something wasn't quite right, and returned until it was. Paulette, who had notarized documents for most of the county at one point or another, said later that Walter Bodine was one of the most deliberate clients she had ever worked with. Not in a difficult way, but in the way of a man who understood that the point of doing something was doing it correctly, and who was not going to sign anything until he was certain it reflected exactly what he intended. He made 9 trips in 18 months. Cobb waited in the truck for the first few visits, until Paulette, who had no rule about dogs, and who had taken a liking to the animal through the window, invited him inside. After that, Cobb sat next to Walter's chair during the appointments, and Paulette said the dog seemed to understand the gravity of the occasion in the same vague, ambient way dogs sometimes seem to understand things, settled, present, and entirely untroubled by the paperwork. Walter died on a Tuesday in November. He had not been sick, or had not said he was sick, which with Walter were not necessarily the same thing. His heart simply stopped, the way hearts do sometimes, quietly and without negotiation. It was Cobb who was with him when it happened, and Cobb who was still with him when Gretchen, alarmed by 2 days of no answer at the door, called the sheriff's department. The deputy who responded noted in his report that the dog was calm, which was the word he used, though Gretchen, when she read the report later, thought that calm was not quite right. Present was closer. Cobb had been present in the way that animals are sometimes present, at the edge of a thing too large for them to understand, but not too large for them to feel. Gary arrived that evening. He was efficient and sad and competent in the way that Gary handled things, and he put Cobb in the barn with water and food and told himself he would figure out the dog situation once the immediate situation was handled. The immediate situation took most of the next 4 days. By the time Gary and Paul were ready to leave, Cobb was gone. The barn door had not been forced. He had simply found his way out, the way dogs with a reason to go somewhere sometimes do, and the way Walter had taught him, without fuss, without announcement, just quietly and with intention. Gary posted the flyer at the gas station. He told himself the dog would turn up. He drove home. He answered emails and went back to work. And in the spaces between things thought about his father with the particular guilty sadness of someone who knows they have left something important undone and can no longer do it. The weeks passed. November became December. The estate attorney sent paperwork. Gary signed what he was asked to sign and set aside what required more attention and kept meaning to deal with it, and hadn't yet when his phone rang on a Thursday afternoon and an unfamiliar number came up with a Tullamore area code. Deputy Birch was 29 and had been on the job for 3 years and had never made a call quite like this one. He explained about the dog, about Paulette's office, and about the tag on Cobb's collar with Walter Bodine's name and address. He said the family might want to come up before any decisions were made about the animal, and he said it in a way that Gary understood meant there was more to it than the dog. Gary told him he'd be there the next day. He called Paul, who said he was busy through the end of the week, and asked Gary to handle it and report back. Gary said he would, and hung up, and then sat at his kitchen table for a while, before he started packing a bag. Cobb had traveled the 18 miles from the Tullamore property to Hendricks on foot. This was the conclusion Birch had reached after checking with Animal Control and the county's road department, neither of whom had received any reports of the dog being transported or found and relocated. He had walked along county roads and farm roads. I navigated 2 small bridges, crossed a stretch of state highway, at a point where a farmer who had been driving that stretch on the relevant morning reported there was a large German shepherd moving in a straight line along the shoulder with a purposefulness that the farmer had found, in his words, a little uncanny. The dog had arrived at Paulette's office on a Tuesday morning and had been sitting outside when she arrived to open up and had not moved for 4 hours, despite her best efforts to relocate him. He was not aggressive. He was not distressed. He was, Paulette said when Gary came to see her, simply there, the same way he had always been there when Walter came, settled outside the door, patient and certain, and waiting for whatever needed to happen next to happen. And Gary sat across from Paulette at her desk, and she walked him through what she was permitted to say, which was not the contents of the documents, but the nature of them. That Walter had been thorough, that he had been intentional, that he had asked good questions and made careful choices and had come back as many times as necessary to make sure everything was exactly right. She said she had liked his father very much and had not said so while he was alive, because Walter was not a man who seemed to want to be told things like that, but that she was saying it now because his son was sitting across from her and seemed like someone who needed to hear something true about his father, and she thought this was true. Gary thanked her. He sat in his car in the parking lot for a few minutes before he drove to the estate attorney's office. See, what the attorney laid out over the following 2 hours was not what Gary had expected. Walter had amended his will 3 times in the preceding 2 years. He had established, using proceeds from the sale of a small parcel of land the previous spring, a scholarship in Ruth's name at the county high school, an annual award for a student pursuing agricultural or environmental studies, managed by the school's foundation, endowed at a level that would sustain it for at least 15 years without additional contributions. He had transferred the deed on the 10 acres the Dietrichs had been farming to Marcus and Sarah Dietrich outright, at no cost, with a letter in the file that said only that they had farmed the land as if it mattered, and that he thought it should belong to people who understood that it did. And he had established a formal right of first purchase for Gretchen on the farmhouse and the surrounding 2 acres at a price set significantly below market value, with a written note explaining that she had been a neighbor in the fullest sense of that word, and that he wanted her to have the security of knowing the option was there, whether she used it or not. The remainder of the estate, the equipment, the savings account, the residual land, was divided between Gary and Paul in equal shares. It was less than they had assumed they were inheriting. It was considerably less. Gary called Paul from the parking lot. He laid it out as plainly as he could. Paul was quiet for a moment, and then not quiet. He talked about the Dietrichs and the manner in which a landlord-tenant relationship could be leveraged to manufacture a sense of obligation. He talked about Gretchen and the way isolated elderly people could become susceptible to influence from those closest to them. He talked about the 3 amendments and whether a pattern of revision might indicate a mind that was not fully stable. He said the word contestable twice and the word attorney 3 times, and by the end of the call had mostly convinced himself that this was a situation requiring a legal response and not a personal one. Gary listened to all of it. He said he would think about it. He hung up and drove to Gretchen's house. Gretchen made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table, and she talked for close to 2 hours. She talked about the furnace and the tomatoes, and the pretexts they had both understood were pretexts. She talked about the Dietrichs and what Walter had said about them. That farming like it matters is the only way to farm, which was as close as Walter got to a philosophy of life stated out loud. She talked about Ruth's scholarship and how Walter had spent 3 months researching how to establish it correctly, driving to the county library and asking the librarian to help him understand the relevant legal structures, calling the school's foundation twice to make sure the terms were right, sending Paulette a draft before their first appointment, and asking her to tell him if anything looked wrong. She talked about the way Walter had been in his last years, not diminished, not confused, but clarified, she said, like a man who had decided what was important and was spending his remaining time acting on it without distraction or delay. Gary drove out to the farm after he left Gretchen's. He parked in the driveway and sat looking at the house for a while. The fields were dormant in December, pale and flat under a gray sky, and the farmhouse looked smaller than he remembered it from childhood. Or maybe he had just grown into a different kind of large. He thought about his father driving to Hendricks 9 times with his dog. He thought about a man who spent months researching how to endow a scholarship correctly because he wanted to do right by his wife's memory. He thought about a dog walking 18 miles down a county road to sit outside the office where his owner had done his most important work, as if proximity to the place was a kind of tribute, as if being there meant something even after the man who had gone there was gone. He called Paul that evening. He told him they were not contesting the will. Paul said that was a significant financial decision. Gary said that was true, and they were still not contesting it. Paul said he deserved a vote. Gary said he did, and the vote was 2-0 in favor of honoring their father's wishes, because Gary was voting for Walter. There was a silence on the line long enough that Gary checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Paul said he needed a few days. Gary said that was fine. He waited. He drove home the next morning, went back to work, answered emails, and did not call Paul again. 4 days later, Paul called him. He did not say much. He said, "Okay." He said they would let it stand. Gary said thank you and meant it in more ways than he explained. The will stood without challenge. The scholarship was formally endowed the following January and gave out its first award in the spring. A 16-year-old girl from the south end of the county who wanted to study environmental soil science, and who stood at the podium at the awards assembly and said Ruth Bodine's name carefully and with a seriousness that made the school's foundation director, who had processed a lot of these awards over the years, feel something she hadn't expected to feel. The Dietrichs received their deed, and did not frame it, as Gary had imagined they might. They put it in a file folder and went back to work, which was, he came to understand, exactly what Walter would have expected them to do. Gretchen exercised her option on the farmhouse and moved in before Christmas, and said later that she had not expected it to feel like coming home, since she had not lived there before, but that it did, which she attributed to the fact that a house where someone has lived honestly tends to hold that quality in its walls. Cobb went home with Deputy Birch. This had not been anyone's plan, including Birch's, but the afternoon he had spent with the dog while waiting for Gary to arrive had produced in him a certainty about the animal that he couldn't fully explain and didn't try to. The dog was calm and steady and had about him an air of completed purpose, like a letter that had been delivered. And Birch thought he deserved somewhere good to spend the rest of his days. He had a house with a yard. The dog needed a house with a yard. It was, as most of the right things in this story were, simpler than it looked. Birch takes Cobb out to the Bodine property sometimes, on his days off. The Dietrichs don't mind the visits, and sometimes Marcus comes out and walks with them, not saying much, which Birch has come to appreciate. Cobb walks the fence line the same way he always did with Walter. Methodical, unhurried, following a path worn into the grass by years of the same two sets of feet, going the same direction at the same time each morning. Birch walks it with him and thinks about a man he never met who drove 18 miles 9 times with his dog to make sure the people around him were taken care of. And who said almost nothing about it to anyone, and who left behind more than anyone had known to look for. Gary visits twice a year now. He drives up alone, stays at the one motel in Toolmore, has breakfast at the diner on the square, and makes the rounds: Gretchen's house, the Dietrich farm, the high school where the scholarship plaque is mounted near the front office with Ruth's name on it, and below it the names of the recipients so far, growing year by year. He sits with Gretchen sometimes, and they drink coffee and talk about Walter, which is something Gary has found he needs to do more than he expected, and which Gretchen has found she is glad to do, because Walter was worth talking about, and not enough people knew that yet. Paul came up once, 6 months after the estate was settled, and he walked the farm with Gary, and didn't say much. At the end of the afternoon, standing by the fence line in the long flat light of a July evening, he said that he thought their father had been lonelier than either of them had understood, and Gary said yes, and that was true, and also that their father had done more with that loneliness than most people did with company. Paul thought about that for a while. He has not been back since, but Gary believes he will come again eventually, because that is the thing about a truth that fits. It doesn't let you go just because you walked away from it. There is a bench at the county high school now, outside the office where the scholarship applications come in each spring. It has Walter and Ruth's names on a small plaque, and below the names, in plain letters, to a phrase that Gary chose after some thought and that the school's foundation approved without alteration: he farmed like it mattered. It is not a phrase Walter ever used about himself. It is a phrase he used about a young couple leasing 10 acres on the edge of his property, which is perhaps exactly why it is the right thing to say about him. A man's life is not always visible from the outside. Sometimes it takes a dog walking 18 miles down a county road in November to make his sons understand what kind of man their father had been, and what kind of sons they still had the chance to be. Walter Bodine had nothing, they thought. A farm, a quiet life, a dog, a small town that the rest of the world had no reason to notice. But a man who spends his final years getting things right, who funds a scholarship and gives land to people who earned it and makes sure his neighbor has somewhere safe to grow old, that man did not have nothing. He had everything that actually counts. He had just never felt the need to tell anyone, which, when you think about it, was the most Walter thing about it.